네, 계속해서 두 번째 특별 강연을 시작하겠습니다. 네, 두 번째 특별 강연은 21세기 노동사회 정책의 미래라는 주제로 이야기를 나눠보겠는데요. 샌드라 폴라스키 전 국제노동기구 부총재님께서 강의해 주시겠습니다. 여러분 큰 박수로 맞아주십시오.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am absolutely delighted to join you this afternoon, and thanks and congratulations to the Hankyoreh Media Group for organizing this forum on this very important topic. I'm especially happy to join you for this discussion now at a time when your new political leadership at the national level has put social issues and the economic transformation of your economy side by side on its agenda. And it's also a time when I understand that many local governments in Korea are playing very important roles in innovation on social and economic policy. In my remarks, I would like to get very practical. We've heard fascinating discussions earlier today and just now from my colleague, Guy Standing. But I would like to try to bring these questions to a very practical level. In other words, going from the first part of the title, the future of work, what is the future of work, the question, to the practical question of how do you construct a new social contract. My remarks are organized around two questions. First, what are the main challenges in the employment and social spheres? And second, what are the best responses? So to begin, I think in terms of identifying the main challenges that have to be considered and addressed, that it is good to ask these three questions. First, will work disappear? This is a lot of what we were talking about this morning, and the question is very prominent, obviously, behind this forum. So I want to offer my own practical thoughts, looking a little bit at some historical lessons in productivity, some of which have already been mentioned, to try to give a tentative answer to that question. Second, when is the future? We're talking about the future of work, but when? When are we talking about? Tomorrow, 5 years from now, 50 years from now? We saw that some AI professionals predict that it will be, I think approximately on average, their prediction on average is that it will be 125 years from now. So when are we talking? How far ahead should we look when we're making decisions that affect our societies, our households, our workers today and tomorrow? I think it's also very important to ask, and we've heard a lot about this already today, what are the known challenges? That is, what are the challenges that we can see and measure today? Challenges that already exist but have not been effectively addressed. And so they continue to produce undesirable or suboptimal results for our societies and for our economy. So to look at each of these questions briefly, could I have this back? Thanks. Will work disappear? As several people already mentioned this morning, we can look to two areas to try to give us some clues to be able to answer this question. Of course, we cannot predict what will actually exist 50 years from now or 100. No one ever can, and we cannot do that. However, it's useful to look at history, and again, as we've heard from some speakers this morning, we can look at what happened in the first and second and third industrial revolutions, or as Guy just said, the first 200 industrial revolutions, if we want to go back to fire and the wheel and so many other brilliant innovations. And we can look at that history to try to see what will happen in terms of eliminating work from new technological developments. And what we see is that in the past, even the most dramatic breakthroughs in technology, and here I would mention steam engine, mass production, electricity, computers, did not lead to an overall diminution in the level of employment. However, they did lead to a redistribution of jobs across occupational skills and sectors that changed the composition of employment. New technologies will eliminate jobs, of course they will, but typically in the past, as new technologies are employed, other jobs develop, either based on the complementarity between human beings and machines. We heard quite a bit about that this morning. or by stimulating new demand because there are new products that people want, or more importantly, through economic growth, which gives people the means to buy those new products that technology has put in front of them. So these have been the engines that have kept the level of employment relatively stable, again, within each economy. The level of employment differs. Some places you have 5% unemployment, some places 3%, some places 11%, or you have big informal economies. But technology in itself has not affected the level of employment. And again, this is the pattern that we have observed over centuries, over other industrial revolutions. Of course, there will be transition costs from this transition. So some people will lose their jobs and they will need support while they retrain, while they find new jobs, and that period of time could be extensive. So it's very important to have proper policies in place, to have the proper safety net, the proper social insurance, unemployment insurance, et cetera, to be able to assist those who are directly affected. And I would argue that it was the failure to assist those who have lost, not so much from technology, although perhaps also technology, but from globalization. Those who were losing have not been adequately assisted, and they, in fact, have become the very anxious, disgruntled members of electorates that make foolish choices because they are so insecure and so frustrated. Another way of looking at how we can answer the question, will work disappear, is to look at what productivity is telling us about the impact of these technologies. And here it's important to remember that if we define the fourth industrial revolution, as most people do, as robotics and artificial intelligence, these technologies have been with us for decades. We have had robots in factories, yes, becoming more sophisticated, more powerful. We have had artificial intelligence, and yes, Google Translate is much more accurate today than it was 5 or 10 years ago, but these are not unknown technologies. And what we have seen is that with all the technology that we have, and with those new technologies included, in fact, there has not been an acceleration of productivity, which would lead to elimination of jobs, but in fact, the growth rate of productivity has been slowing in almost every country and in most sectors. And therefore, it's hard to say that these technologies, which are already being deployed in their current stage of development, will somehow, in the foreseeable future, lead to the elimination of jobs. They're not increasing productivity enough to be able to do that. So to the next question, when is the future? Of course, as I said, we don't know what the future will be 50 years from now. We don't know where artificial intelligence will go. There's a lot of things we don't know about the future. Not only will technology change, but forms of political organization will change. Unfortunately, military capacity will change. The distribution of power in the world will change. Many things are unknown. So I would argue that the most important thing when making policy is to think about a future which is today, what we know today, and to project the trends that we can already see and know, and project what they may do in the foreseeable future, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, perhaps even 20 years, and make policy on that basis. Because the policies that are made are going to affect the possibilities for individuals, for workers, for households, for society, and it's very important to address the right problems, not theoretical problems, but the problems that are being faced today. So, what are the known challenges? What are the problems that we're facing today? First, let me start at the broadest measurement level, and several speakers have already mentioned this. The broadest way of addressing what's happening to workers and to households is to look at the labor share of national income. And Richard this morning and Guy just now has mentioned that in almost all countries, the share of national income that is going to capital has been increasing, and the share that's going to labor, to workers, to people's paychecks has been decreasing. This has been happening now for 4 or 5 decades in many countries, including the US, where I come from, and for at least 20 years now, it's been happening in Korea as well. And actually, it's been happening very rapidly in Korea, that the share going to labor has been decreasing, and the share going to capital has been increasing. What does this mean to say the share of national income? It reflects, obviously, what people have to spend, what they have for their living standards, but it also reflects power. As the greater share of national income is going to capital, it is both because they have increased their political power to write the rules, many of which Guy has just very eloquently described, and they can thereby increase their political power, which will increase their share. Whereas labor in most countries have seen not only stable or decreasing incomes as part of the national income, but less political power as well. So let's turn to the specifics facing Korea. And many of these I'm sure that you know in greater detail than I do, but just very quickly I want to identify them to come to the second question of what are the best responses. I would argue that one of the top challenges facing Korea today is that fully 1/3 of all Korean workers are engaged in irregular or non-standard or precarious work, including temporary contracts, involuntary part-time work, dispatched work, and so on. That percentage, by the way, is extremely high. Again, just by point of comparison, in my country, in the US, the percentage of workers who don't have what you might call a standard employment relationship is about 17%. And that is in a very liberal, deregulated economy, labor market. So Korea is twice as high. This is a severe anomaly compared to the history and experience in your country over many years and compared to many other countries in the modern era. Not only are those jobs less secure, less predictable, therefore causing more anxiety, but they pay workers in Korea 36% less per hour, matching skill level to skill level. You would make 36% less per hour than in a standard employment relationship. The majority of those workers are not covered by the National Pension Scheme or by the Employment Insurance Scheme, which provides unemployment insurance. And particularly affected are women and older workers. And I think it's important to pause for a moment on the point that older workers are particularly affected because although we know that young workers are facing very difficult times in the labor market in many countries, including in Korea, some of these trends toward insecurity, low wage, lack of benefits actually are affecting older workers more than young workers. In Korea, that's what the data shows. In the US, that's what the data shows. So it's a bit confusing to people who have thought simply by looking at experience that it's young people most affected. But at least in those two countries, I can tell you that the data that we have says that it's older workers who are even more severely affected. Not listed here, but certainly a problem that we heard about this morning, and definitely one of the key problems in Korea, is the very long hours worked both by regular workers and by irregular workers. Again, among the highest in the OECD. Additional key problems in Korea: almost 1/4 of Korean workers earn low pay, which is defined as workers earning less than 2/3 of median pay or bonuses. And again, this is one of the highest shares of low pay in the OECD. Wage inequality and relative poverty are high. And elder poverty in particular is a serious problem in Korea. Almost half of all older people are in relative poverty, according to OECD statistics. And absolute poverty affects 30% of older people in Korea. This is an astonishing figure, and it's considered a factor in the high suicide rates seen among the elderly in Korea. So this is a quick sketch of some of what I would consider to be the most outstanding problems in the employment and social spheres. Another problem is that even where laws and regulations exist on paper to address these challenges, and of course you do have a set of laws and regulations on labor markets and social benefits, there has been a serious problem of lack of enforcement in Korea, such that particularly with respect to payment of minimum wages and payment of social contributions to pensions and other social insurances, many employers are avoiding those payments. And when the government doesn't do its job to enforce what laws and protections there are, one might turn to trade unions to do it. But again, as we heard today, the level of trade union representation is low in Korea. And so you do You could call them the guardians or the watchdogs in the workplace who could insist on employers to be compliant and who could also advocate for workers' rights more broadly and for higher pay and better terms and conditions of employment. I can point out, as coming from the ILO, that the ILO expert official supervisory committees have repeatedly called for reforms of the Korean Trade Unions and Labor Relations Adjustment Act because it does not meet even the most minimum international standards. Let me just turn for a moment to the topic of the gig economy or the online platform work or what you so charmingly call the digital nomads. What do we know about this and how extensive is it? Comprehensive data really is lacking on this, but in the US, for example, several recent very rigorous studies have found that online platform workers, and this is including now, for example, Uber as well as TaskRabbit and the other online platform work, make up less than 1% of the US workforce. And there is a very interesting ongoing monitoring study at Oxford University which has found that for Asia as a whole, they don't give the specific figures for Korea yet, but for Asia as a whole, the supply of and demand for online freelance labor amounts to about 1/5 of that observed in the US. So if it's less than 1% in the US, then it is a very small portion indeed in Korea. Very often the statements about the huge number of people who work has to do with the number of people who may log on in the course of a month or the course of a year. But in terms of the discrete, separate individuals who do that work and who do it on a repeated basis, the number is much, much smaller than what you normally hear. However, even though this is a very small segment of the overall workforce, I would put it in the context of the overall erosion of labor standards and protections. I would put it in the overall context of the rising insecurity of employment. So whether it's temporary work, part-time work, dispatch work, or online platform work, all of these are part of the same trend which has taken away from the standard employment relationship and put people into less advantageous situations, including in Korea. So keeping in mind what I've just said, this quick sketch of policies, what are the best policy solutions? It's important to remember when we start to try to think through what would be the best responses, and we've already heard an array of suggestions about possible directions, is that these trends that I've just been describing have resulted in part from technology, in part from economic forces and globalization, but they have also resulted in very significant part from mistaken policies by governments, including in the past by the Korean government. For example, labor market deregulation, the weakening of trade unions, the reduction of taxes on the wealthy. These policies in many countries were guided by unfounded ideology that if you put more wealth and power into the hands of employers and owners of capital, they will spend and the results will trickle down to the advantage of everybody. Those results, that claim has been debunked again and again and again in rigorous studies. It isn't true, and yet it continues to be advanced and followed by some governments. In my country, in the US, we are now looking at a major tax cut on the theory that, once again, this will happen when in fact it has never happened. But it isn't just unfounded ideology. It's the fact that governments can be captured by the wealthy, by investors, by industries, including the new tech industry. These trends have contributed to this erosion of the security of employment, and they will continue unless strong political effort is mounted to correct them. A new policy framework and a new paradigm of distribution will have to be based on a sound analysis of the problems, which is why I've gone through this quick summary of what the problems are as we know them now, but it will also require strong civic discussion, strong public involvement, and indeed strong public mobilization in order to be able to change these trends and to shift power back into the hands of the workers and the households and away from the owners of capital. So as a way to move forward, I propose that one thinks about this in a framework, and in that framework, the first step would be to address the known and existing challenges. Why is that? If we neglect to address these problems that I have quickly outlined, then we will be building in a future, including perhaps new paradigms that leave unaddressed current existing problems, and so you'll be beginning from a very unsatisfactory equilibrium. You need to solve the problems that we're facing before you anticipate the problems that may arise 50 years from now or 100 years from now. And I believe the way to think about building this framework is to construct an adequate employment and social protection floor, a floor that is a foundation of guaranteed rights, guaranteed by law, guaranteed protections, including social protections that are well-designed and well-funded, a social contract that individuals, young people, workers, households, older people can count on. In Korea today, after decades of remarkable, astonishing, and admirable economic growth and development, nevertheless, a full social framework, a full social floor, or social protection system has not been built. You have a very partial system with enormous gaps in it, weak enforcement, as I mentioned, and there is much work that needs to be done. And I think that the right framework, again, for thinking about this is to complete, improve, remodel, update that social floor, dealing with the challenges that we already know and that we can project will continue to affect labor and social protection and households in the foreseeable future. Then, when that's constructed and you have a much better equilibrium in terms of the labor share of national income, in terms of protections and security, in terms of the individual alive today being able to plan their future career, then there will be time and there will be a sound foundation to think about challenges that may emerge from artificial technology that we have not seen yet. And I should say that as part of this framework, I would assume and argue that work will not disappear, as I have already said, nor should it disappear. Work organizes the contributions of individuals to the society and to the economy. It contributes to the individual's sense of purpose, self-realization, and social engagement. And it creates a sense of shared responsibility between those who work and contribute and others, and thus it builds social cohesion. The fact that some work is disagreeable or harmful or leaves people in poverty is not an argument against work. It's a cry for improving the regulations that would protect workers from those conditions. So within this broad framework, what should be the specific priorities in Korea, in the Korean context? I am not Korean, but I've certainly studied your economy and bring to bear, as I mentioned, lessons from other countries and from the global economy. And I would propose 5 areas that I think are most in need of reform. It could be 6 or 7, but let me concentrate on these. And I think that these reforms would be deep enough that really they should be called a new paradigm. It would be a new paradigm for Korea. The first of these necessary reforms is to improve the incomes and job security for those fully 1/3 of Korean workers who are currently in irregular employment and converge their status, their wages, and their benefits up to those in the standard employment relationship. A number of the international organizations talk about duality in the labor market, and you have one of the most extremely dual labor markets, as I mentioned before. But sometimes the very wrong policy advice to end the duality is to converge the standard of those who have decent wages and benefits downward. And that is absolutely the wrong direction to go. Ethically, socially, in terms of social cohesion, and even economically, as Korea looks for a new economic model which is less dependent on export demand and more dependent on domestic demand, raising the incomes of Korean people to be able to have better living standards is going to be an important part of the equation. And if you can lift up that 1/3 of the workforce to the standards that exist today for standard employment relationships, that would not only be ethically sound, but it would give a very big boost to this effort to depend more on domestic demand and not on export demand. You know, in the past, there have been a number of legislative steps taken toward that goal, but I think that those who have studied would agree with me that they have been not only insufficient and ineffectively enforced, but in fact, they have not solved the problem, and the problem is getting worse. Your new administration has already taken some important steps. For example, the significant increase in the minimum wage, which will disproportionately work to the advantage of these precarious workers who get lower wages and are more likely to be at the minimum wage level. And also, the new administration has begun to take some steps to work toward convergence, at least in the public sector, and those are to be greatly applauded. And there are also important initiatives at the local level, and I hope we'll hear more about them in the next panel, where we will be joined by some mayors, because the local level can be a wonderful place for experimentation and for natural experiments where one city tries one approach, another city tries another, and you can compare the results and go forward on that basis. Second among the high priorities is to tackle this problem that I mentioned of elder poverty, which I think must be a huge emotional stress, not only on the elderly, of course it is, but on everybody in this room. I'm sure that there are no Koreans who want to live in a society where the elderly are considered disposable, where they can be thrown to the trash heap. And I think that the steps that will actually address this problem of elder poverty are multiple. They come from various directions. Increases in wages will certainly help the elderly. And I have to say that the changes to the peak wage system pose real problems. There are other ways of dealing with retention of elderly workers, of older workers, and I don't think that that's going to be one of the successful ways of dealing with it. But certainly raising minimum wages is going to affect them. As I said, the elderly who do work are disproportionately affected by precarious work and low wages, so that will be important. Increases in pensions. The Korean pension is far too low for the level of GDP of this economy. It needs to be raised, and the social contributions that will sustain it into the future need to be increased. And an end to discrimination against older workers that pushes them out of the labor market. As we all grow older, as societies grow older, it will be important to make it possible for people to work longer. It's the only way that you can have a sustainable income over the life cycle when people are living 5, 10, 15, 20 years longer than pensions were designed for. People need to both pay more into pensions so that they have better financial foundations, but they also need to work longer. And so the discrimination, which is pushing people out of the door right now, needs to be addressed and ended. And if these things are done, this is the big contribution to a new social contract, because not only will it improve the well-being of the older workers who are directly affected, but it says to their children, the middle-aged workers, and their grandchildren, the millennials, and to people coming along after that, we have a sound social contract. We won't abandon you in old age, and I think that will be a very important part, again, of strengthening social cohesion. A third area as a priority for reform is to buttress the capacity and to exercise the political will by government to enforce labor laws and social contributions, starting with the existing ones, and as it's possible to reform these laws, for example, for trade unions and for converging upward irregular work to the standards of regular work, to enforce the current laws and the improved laws is a very important part of the equation. And hopefully the new administration will be able to do a great deal on that, because some of it does not require legislative change. It requires the political will and the know-how to be able to go and to do effective enforcement, again, using modern technology. And fourth, a very important mechanism to reset this shifting balance between capital and labor, which has shifted so far toward capital, is the urgent need to strengthen trade unions and their right to organize, workers' right to organize and their ability to organize, and the right to bargain collectively. Finally, as a priority, I would put the tax system into that short list. And that is because Korea currently, among OECD countries, has one of the very lowest tax collection rates. I think it's about 24% right now. far lower than countries that have adequate social protection systems, less inequality, and more cohesion. And it's time to do the reforms up to the tax system that will both make society more fair, but that will also provide the resources for the public goods and the quality of life that people want to have. So based on my observations of the Korean situation, and again drawing on the experience from other countries, I'm convinced that these 5 elements should be at the top of the priority list within that broader framework of constructing a social floor or a new social contract, and to be complemented at local levels, such wonderful laboratories of experiments. Let me turn now to 3 other proposals that have been advanced, one just before me by my colleague Guy Standing, and 2 others that I want to comment on. And in the case of basic income or universal basic income, I would like to take just a very practical approach. I think I asked the questions, at what level would the basic income be set? What would be the cost? Who would pay? And would there be redistribution compared to current social programs? I won't say anything more about the concept of how it would work because Guy has explained that very, very clearly and very well. Instead, looking at these practical questions. The Alaskan Citizens Benefit, which, as we heard this morning, was $2,000 a year, and then that was reduced to $1,000 a year, did not come from eliminating other social programs. It came from an entirely new income source for the government, which was the leasing of rights for oil and gas exploration, drilling, and extraction. So in that sense, you don't have any trade-off. It was something new and additional money that was there and distributed. However, even at the $2,000 level, even in a family of 4, this would have left the household far, far below the poverty line. It would not have eliminated the need for decent work, for good jobs, and would not have eliminated the need for other social programs. So if money had been taken from other social programs to pay for it, you would have people who were still very far below the poverty line. In the Finnish experiment that Guy referred to, a test group of unemployed people will receive 550 to 600 euros a month, which is roughly the level of welfare and unemployment benefits that they were receiving. It would replace those benefits, and the difference would be that they would not have any conditionalities. They would not have to report to a caseworker to prove that they were poor. They would not have to put in a certain number of job applications every month. They would not have to take a job that was offered but that they didn't want. So a no-strings approach. The income level is the same for this test group as for the comparison group that it continues to receive the welfare benefits with the conditionalities. And the goal really of the experiment is to find out how that will affect behaviors. Now, the Finnish government in particular, which happens to be a right-of-center government which implemented this program, is most interested in finding out what will be the effect on work effort. They would like to have a system where more people work more instead of receiving welfare. So they are looking at work effort primarily. They will look at some other factors in terms of overall well-being, child health, et cetera. But so that is the purpose of that experiment. Surely it will be interesting to see what we learn from that and from other experiments. However, if a basic income were to provide at least the minimum level of income needed to lift people out of poverty, the economic proposition, the cost, becomes very, very different. For example, in the US, $1,000 a month would not lift even an individual out of poverty. It would have to be higher than $1,000 a month. But say it was set at $1,000 a month, that would cost approximately $2.9 billion a year. The entire US budget is $3.8 billion a year. So you would have to almost double the source of revenue. This could come from taxes, but quite frankly, I don't see income taxes, value-added taxes, a technology tax, any other tax that I can think of doubling the revenues of the government in the foreseeable future. Or you could substitute spending on other social programs to pay for it. Okay, thanks. Other social programs cost $2.3 billion a year. So to find $2.9 billion, In effect, you would have to eliminate all of them. That would be Social Security, old age pensions, Medicare, old age insurance, Medicaid, all of the Obamacare payments for coverage, and indeed, all of the people in need of those programs would be worse off with $1,000 a month than they are under the current programs. So it's quite difficult for me to see how a basic income at a level that is meaningful to get people out of poverty can be affordable, even with other sources of incomes. But that said, partial basic income could certainly be an interesting part of a new paradigm and is something that should be experimented with. Now, I see that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just say very quickly the other competing proposals and not go into any detail. I've written about them in the paper that you have in your materials. Another idea is to have a public employment guarantee, whereby the government would act as the employer of last resort and give an income to people in exchange for doing work. There is an extremely interesting program in India, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program, which has existed for about 10 years now, operated at the state level, and it doesn't operate well at all states in India. They're very different. But where it does operate well, it has produced remarkable results in terms of reducing child labor, increasing nutrition levels, making the minimum wage binding in the area where the work is done. And in fact, it's like the public employment programs that were launched in the US and many countries during the Great Depression. This is promising. There are small experiments going on many places, including in the US, for public employment, which would be provided perhaps by cooperatives, worker cooperatives, or by nonprofit organizations with a payment stream from the government. They would organize the work, people would receive the money, but they would do socially useful work as part of the compact. And I think that has to be thought about as well. And finally, very quickly, a proposal that I do not recommend and that I hope is not in the policy thinking in Korea now is the idea of reducing what's called the labor tax wedge. That is the taxes that employers pay on top of the wage for pension systems, for employment insurance, and so on. That had been the very strong advice of some international organizations like the IMF and the OECD. It's not a good idea. It has not created additional employment. Lots of studies have been done. You'll find them in your text. I was happy to see when I looked at the most recent policy advice to Korea from the IMF and the OECD that they have dropped that recommendation because it's so clearly inappropriate. So I've gone a little bit over my time. Let me just conclude by saying that this is really an exciting time in Korea. Unlike my experience in the United States and some other places in the world, Korea has shown that its democracy is vibrant, that people are engaged with their societies, and that, in fact, they're able to make candlelight revolutions. It's incredibly exciting. The agenda that's been set out by your new administration is the right agenda. Bringing it to fruition will require effort by everyone. As I say, public participation, public mobilization really are indispensable in order to getting to the full goals of a coherent, just society with a good new social contract. So good luck to you. Thank you.
네, 좋은 발표해 주신 산드라 폴라스키님께 다시 한번 감사 인사드리겠습니다. Thank you for sharing your perspectives on the practical issues and challenges that we confront today here in Korea. Thank you for your wonderful presentation.